Hello everybody and welcome back to the Fusion 360 for FTC series. This is the 18th video in the series. If you haven't watched the previous 17 videos, I recommend you do so by clicking on the card in the corner. We did it! We made it! This is one of my favorite parts whenever I'm CADing something in Fusion, and that's when we get to render what we've done. The renders are really nice. They look super good. They can be used on your website and your engineering notebook, whatever you want. And Fusion has a great rendering software built in. It's very simplistic, which means that if you want to start getting into custom lighting and all that sort of stuff, you should try a different software. But Fusion renders are just really great right out of the box. They're super easy to do. They're quick, and it has for the student license, you have unlimited use on rendering on their servers. So you can just render without using your machine, and you won't be limited by your computer's whatever cards or CPU you have built in. First, how do we access the rendering? So we've just been working in this design tab, and we talked about this in the first video when I went over how to navigate the Fusion 360 UI. We have these other workspaces here, and so we're going to go into the rendering tab today. Just like this. It looks a little bit different, but really it's the same. We just got some tools up here. We got our browser. We can hide and unhide stuff. The movement is all the same. So just once you get used to the settings, it's basically the same. So let's go over the settings in the rendering tab. So one of the most important ones is the appearance of my cube here. By default, the default material for everything that you make is like steel, some sort of steel material. But I want to change this, and I think I want my cube to be like a sort of wood, a patterned wood. So how do we access it? It's up here, the sort of color wheel, that's appearance. It's also down here, and the shortcut is A. You can access this in the design tab. If I go back into the design tab, it's under modify right here, and the shortcut is also A. So I'm going to go ahead and choose appearance, and now we have this sort of pop-up here. So Fusion 360 has appearances already built into it. Some of them you have to download. It doesn't take that long. It's not that big of a file, so don't hesitate to download any appearances that you like or you think you're going to use. So I would keep show downloadable materials checked, so you can see all the materials that are available. It breaks it down into category here. They're pretty self-explanatory, except for I think like the miscellaneous and other tabs are kind of weird. Miscellaneous, really the only things I use in miscellaneous are carbon fiber. If I've made something out of carbon fiber, these sort of like emissive bulbs that just emit light. I use those. Maybe you'll use the gemstone, and I also use the rubber for belts and other stuff. The other tab looks similar. It also has the emissive tab, but in fact it has different materials. We can see that we have sort of different carbon fiber here, and for the emissive we actually have these displays. I really don't use these that much. Some people like these displays in the renders. I don't. So usually I don't really use the miscellaneous or other tabs too much, but I use everything else quite a bit. So for my cube, I want it to be wood, and we have two options here. The wood solid is what I normally use. It looks nicer. It has it's sort of like it just looks nicer, and there's more options to pick from. So I'm going to go ahead and choose a finished wood to use, and I'm just going to use maybe this one. I don't know. I've never used this one before. See how it looks. You can put stuff, appearances on objects by just clicking and dragging just like this. And right now I have my thing up here. It's set to apply to bodies and components. So if I drag this onto a body or component, it's going to apply that to the whole body. If I put this on face and I went down here and I chose a different wood, maybe pine semi-gloss, and you could see I could select individual faces. Now for the 3D woods, it says it can't be assigned at a face level. If I chose maybe I don't know, like paint or something, just like this, and we did on a face, you could see that it's replaced that with the enamel gloss. So I'm going to go ahead and tick this back on body/components and put this just like that. And since I've applied a appearance to specific faces, it's going to give me this pop-up, and I'm just going to click remove, and it's going to apply it to everything. Yeah, so that's it for the materials. You really just pick whatever looks the best. There is a great tool that Justin from Omega made. It's kind of like a breakdown for what materials, what looks best for Fusion. So I'll put a link at that in the description below. Next, let's take a look at the environment settings. Now that we have like our appearance of our cube all sorted out, we're basically done with the cube settings for now. There is physical material, which affects the physical properties, but the appearance overrides the appearance of that object, and we really don't need to assign any physical materials when we're rendering. You would use that if you're doing a simulation or generative design or something like that. So you really don't need to worry about that for rendering. So basically, all of what we're going to do is we're going to go into scene settings. We'll take a little look at decal and texture map controls later and the rendering settings, but we're going to be spending a lot of our time in the scene settings when you're rendering. So this basically controls almost all of the settings in your render. It's a very small list, and that's what makes it so great, is that it's so easy and quick to create a nice looking render. So the first thing let's take a look at is our background. If we look around here, you can see it's just sort of like a solid gray, but you can tell that there is some light coming. You can see there it's sort of reflecting just like that. And that's because by default, Fusion has these environments built into it with some more that you can download down here. And this basically just puts realistic lighting. It's sort of like a 360-degree sphere that's around your render, and it has realistic lighting, and it has sort of like a wrapped image. So there are some built in here. You can just, if I change this to like cool light, let's say, you could see that the lighting has changed. But really, let's take a look at how can we see what's in the background. Well, we could change our color. If you didn't like gray, you could change it to, I don't know, like red or something, and then you would have a completely red background to render in. But mostly what I do is I'm going to be putting this on the background as environment. It seems like nothing's changed since our gray, but if we look up, you can see that we got some sort of like panel of lights here. And now we've gotten the 360-degree wrap, which is called an HDRI. We can see that the light is actually coming from here, and it's coming from the bulbs on the ceiling like this. So if I change this to I don't know, like skylight or something, just like this, I'm doing that by holding and dragging onto the canvas, just like the appearances, and I looked up, you could see that we have now changed where the light is coming from, and the image that's wrapping around has changed. If you are using one of the built-in ones that's not one of these down here, or the snowfield, which I've already downloaded. Just one of these like rim highlights, sharp highlights. I'd recommend keeping it on solid color. But really what I do in most of my renders is I use one of these, or mostly what I do is I have a custom HDRI that I've downloaded from a site, and I'll put a link to HDRI Haven, which is where I get all of my HDRIs. It's just free. They have tons of nice HDRIs. And that gives it a really nice background, and it has great lighting. So if I chose Snowfield, just like this, and I've dragged it on, it takes a little bit to load, and I'm still on environment. Now you can see if I rotate around, we got like this sort of snow, we got some light in the sky over there, and we got some rocks. So that we have like an image fully wrapped around, just like this. And so this is a more realistic setting. Now, would we have a cube in the middle of snow? Probably not. So I want to get something that's even more realistic for my render. So I'm going to go into the environment library, and I'm going to scroll down all the way to the bottom to replace custom environment. And I'm going to click on the folder icon, and I have some HDRIs downloaded, and I'm just going to choose this one that I've downloaded, Machine Shop. Just like that, and it's loading in. It takes a little bit to load. You can see that it's up here in as the current environment, just like this. And now you can see we have a more realistic setting. We have like sort of like maybe we just cut this piece of wood out of all the tools here that are around. The lighting is really great. The background looks realistic. I didn't download it in super high res, only 4K, and that's because we're going to be using some depth of field, so it's all going to be blurred out. But yeah, that's what I prefer. Again, I'll leave a link. You can go download some, and it really makes your renders look much better if you have a more realistic background instead of just the gray or some random background like the snowstorm. That doesn't make any sense. So now that we have our HDRI in, let's talk about some of the settings that we can use with the HDRI. First of all, we have the brightness and the positioning, and these two are pretty important. They really control a lot in your render. So if I up this brightness just by dragging the slider, you can also change this value up here, is you would notice that the HDRI lighting is getting brighter and brighter and brighter. And if I dropped it below 1000, you'd see that it's getting darker. If I put it at 0, there's no light being emitted by the HDRI. So this one's pretty important. It's pretty easy. A lot of times I just keep it on 1000 and I change the exposure later, and I'll show you how to do that. But I'm just going to keep it on 1000 for now. Looks fine. You just put it on whatever looks good to you. If you want a sort of like dark render, you'd put it below 1000. And it's HDRI specific too. A nighttime HDRI is going to be darker at 1000 than this sort of daytime indoors HDRI. Next, let's talk about positioning. So right now I'm looking at the top left of the cube, and if I was just to rotate down a little bit so you can see the background, and I opened up the position just by clicking on this move icon here, I have two options here. The one that this is controlling, I really don't use that one that much. You can see it's just like cutting it off. It's like positioning the bottom of the HDRI. I think I don't really use that. But if I did, the rotation is important because it's rotating the HDRI and its positioning relative to the cube, basically. So as you can see, when I change this, we're sort of like rotating the background. And this is rotating what's in the background, but also more importantly, it's changing the lighting. on the cube. So it's important to find something where the background looks nice and the lighting also looks nice. Um, so I just want like, I don't want it to be completely flat on top like this. I just want a little bit of like reflection, just like that. Um, I'm happy with that. And I'm going to just, you can just press escape and get out of that and reopen up scene settings. So now we have it positioned. Um, if I rotate it around the cube at this point, you could see that our perspective on the cube is changing. So it looks like the lighting is changing, but the lighting is not changing relative to the cube. It's staying stationary. It's just our perspective of the cube and the lighting. So now we have some options for the ground right here. If I chose flatten ground and we looked around, what you would notice is it has now like sort of squashed the HDRI completely flat. Like all the tools are flattened out and it's sitting on the ground now. For some HDRIs, this can be good. This can be the effect you want. For this one where we have lots of stuff sticking up, that's not what I want. And we'll talk about, like, obviously a realistic cube would not have, a realistic render would not have a cube floating in the air. That doesn't make any sense like it is now. In the next video where we look at rendering our screw and our nut, we'll talk about what's proper composition involving like creating a table for everything to sit on. I'm just going to leave it like this for now. If you did flatten ground and turned on reflections, you could change the roughness of the ground, the HDRI, I think. I really don't use this too much, just like that. For the most realistic renders, as if it's almost a real photo of your robot or whatever it is, you're just going to want it to be sitting on a table or something. Next, let's take a look at the camera settings. This is, again, one of the most important things along with the environment. I think that the camera and the environment are just the most important things, and the ground really doesn't, I really don't modify this too much. So the camera, you have options of how the camera works. So orthographic, you're not going to have any perspective or depth on your camera. I really recommend you just leave that on perspective. If you put on orthographic, it can be good if you're trying to do a nice picture of something and you want the sides to be completely square and everything. If we looked from the like sort of the side, you could see that it's changing how this is functioning, and it's removing the focal length. So I just usually keep it on perspective. Sometimes if I'm rendering a drivetrain and I want them to be able to see like straight down the channel or something and see how everything aligns, I'll turn it on orthographic. The next thing is the focal length. You might be familiar with this, but basically you can just play around with it and see what looks good. So 90 is usually a good starting value, but I usually change it depending on the render. So if I turn this up to like let's say like 100, you'll see that like the background is getting more zoomed in and the cube is sort of flattening out. So I'm just going to put it at like maybe 100, just like this, and I think that looks pretty good. The next thing is the exposure, and that's basically like how much light is it taking in. So if I turn this to the left, you'll see that the value is going up, and it's basically increasing the amount of light needed for the camera to see it. If I decrease this, everything is going to become like super white. It's just all going to be white. Everything is just completely blasted out. So you can find a value. 9.5 is the standard. I think that with this specific one, it could go up a little bit. At 9.5, it's a little dark. And we'll talk about how can you edit this in Fusion 360 with the post-processing tools. But if I just turn this to 9, it's a little bit brighter. Maybe a little less than 9, just like that. Looks pretty good. Now we're on to the last two settings in the scene settings. If I turn on depth of field, which I turn on for almost every single render because it just makes it so much more realistic. Basically what depth of field is going to do, it's going to only make some things in focus in the render. And this is realistic to real life cameras. That not everything is in focus in the camera. So the first thing it's asking for is the center of focus, and this is going to be a singular point where it's completely in focus. So I want the tip of my cube here to be completely in focus, so I'm just going to select it like that. You don't have to be perfect. It sort of like snaps to the faces, so you don't really have to worry about it being not on the cube. So if I just put it somewhere around that corner there, should be pretty good. Now the blur, it's basically the intensity of the depth of field. So if I turn this down, there's going to be less blur, less blur for there's going to be less blur overall, basically. And if I turn this up, there's going to be more blur overall. I think that the starting value of 1 or whatever it is way too high. On robots, I use anywhere between 0.1 and 0.25. For this cube, since it's smaller, I'm going to go ahead with 0.08. That should be fine. And lastly, let's take a look at the aspect ratio. And the viewport aspect ratio is like some ultra wide aspect ratio. It's kind of a weird ratio. So I try to avoid rendering in this ratio. I would recommend 16:9, as that's really kind of the standard now for laptops and basically all sort of monitors. And you'll notice if I change it to 16:9, it sort of grayed out this area, and that means that we won't be able to see it in the render. You can change this later when you're just about to render, but I recommend that you do it when you're setting up your render so you can see what you won't be able to see. Otherwise, if I just left this on viewport and I changed it later, I might think that this is in the shot, but it's really not. If I change it to 1:1 square, all of this will be grayed out. So I'm just going to put it on 16:9. And we're done with our settings for now, the scene settings. So let's take a look at texture map controls and decal. Texture map controls, basically it allows you, this is a texture applied to the face, all the faces. It allows you to change how that texture is behaving. So if I clicked on this, we sort of have like, you can think of the texture on this cube, this wood texture, as sort of like a big flat image, and it's being wrapped around. And the image is actually larger than our cube. So I could actually change how much of that, like what part of that image is on our cube. So right now I'm just sort of free dragging it. I can also rotate just like this, and now we're rotating the image and rotating how it's wrapped. And you can sort of change it just like this. Change what's showing. So for the wood, especially on the table, it's going to sort of make the when we're making our table for things to render on in the next video, I'll talk about this then, but it's going to make the wood grain in line with the robot. So it's going to be perfectly squared away, and that's really not realistic. There's a very small chance that we set down our robot in line with the wood grains of the table. But for this, I kind of want it to just look like it's been chopped away, like a portion chopped out. So I'm just going to have like, this is like my rings here, and this is going to be in line, just like that. I think that's good. That looks pretty nice. I have this off center. It would be unrealistic for it to be perfectly centered. Some sort of like dark stripes here, just like that. I'm going to click OK, and now you can see it's applied just like that. And the last thing we'll be taking a look at is the decal. And basically, this allows you to put an image onto this. So if I went and I looked for some sort of picture, maybe I'll use this for now. And the first thing it asks for is a face. And you'll notice it's just applying the picture of the nut here with the white background and everything. But this allows you to put basically pictures of stuff, and it'll wrap around just like this. So if you're creating, if you're rendering something with motors, I often put the sticker of the motor on because that's more realistic, and the CAD does not come with a decal for the motor. There's some other things that I use it for. You can change the scale just like this. I'll change it uniformly. If you do it like this, it'll stretch it out. There's some other things I use it for. If I make like a blueprint drawing, which we'll be getting into after the rendering videos, of a drivetrain or something, I'll often put that in next to it, as it seems like we followed the blueprint to make the drivetrain, and it can be pretty cool. So I don't want this. This doesn't look realistic. So I'm gonna get rid of it. But it's nice to know how this works. The options here are pretty self-explanatory. Like scaling, you can flip it left and right, up and down. You can change the opacity so you can sort of like it's sort of see-through. And that's basically it. Pretty easy. I'm gonna click cancel so we can get rid of that. And now we've basically set up our render. So let's take a look at some different ways that you can render this. There's basically 3 ways, but I only use 2 of them. So you have the in-canvas render right here, and what this is going to do is it's going to just render it just like this in the canvas. So if I went to the in-canvas settings, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put on fast so we can see it, and I'm going to turn down the resolution just to maybe 50 or something. And if I click lock view, it'll make sure that I don't move the view. If you move the view while doing an in-canvas render, it's going to change the render. Now this is the one I don't use, and that's because it doesn't give high quality renders. And if you're doing like a really advanced sort of render with lots and lots of stuff and reflections and ray tracing, it might crash. So if I just start it here, it's sort of like you'll notice that the resolution is getting better and better, and it's sort of like doing iterations of this, calculating the light and stuff, and you can see the iteration number and the elapsed time counting up here, and it'll get better and better over time. What this might be good for is just testing out your settings quickly, as you can quickly see like if your settings are correct. But I'm just gonna pause it for now, and you can stop it right like this. And that I really don't recommend that you use this. If you do have the student edition, the education edition, you're going to have unlimited cloud credits, and that's basically their currency for using their server. So it's really nice that we have unlimited cloud credits, as we can just render as many times as we want. Here are the other 2 ways to render. You have the cloud render and the local render. And basically the cloud render is going to render on their servers, and the local render is going to render on your computer. So I'm going to go ahead and do both, and so we can see the difference. And I'm going to, as I said, you can change the aspect ratio here, just like this. So I'm going to leave this on 16:9, and I'm going to change my my image size. I'm gonna put this at 1920 by 1080, just like that. And you'll notice that the credits went up. There's more pixels in the image now. Um, I recommend that you put it on final. It'll just give a better render. And this number here is how long it's going to take to render. So it's less than 20 minutes. If I hit render, what you'll notice is that I now have this thing here. And when this is rendering, it'll have a sort of progress bar at the top, and when it's done, you'll have an image here. So I'm going to start a local render as well, so we can compare. Put this on local render, and this is basically the render quality of how good it is. So in the cloud render, we saw the final and standard options. I'm just going to put this on final, so it's the same as this one. Just like that, leave it on 1920 by 1080, and I'm going to render that. I'll be back in a few minutes when this is done, and we'll compare. Now both of our renders have finished, and we can see two images pop up here. This one is my local one, and this one is my cloud one. We can go ahead and open them up by just clicking on the magnifying glass here. And the renders look a little bit wonky. The composition on the scene is off. This is not how I would normally render something. And I think that the appearances that Fusion 360 has built in, they're okay, but they're not great. You can see it's not really a lot of detail here. It looks kind of weird. It's sort of low res, and it's all like completely flat. So this is my cloud one here, and if I on the cloud one benefit of the cloud one over a local render is that I can go ahead and use the post-processing tab right here, and I can change some of the settings. So the exposure value just changes the exposure, just like this. I think we could go a little bit higher on this image. It was at 9.2 or 1 originally. I think I'm going to drop it down to 8.8, just like that, make it a little bit brighter. And then this is sort of like your color difference. When you put it on vivid, it sort of like extends contrast, as it says, and makes it more vibrant. If I change this to mild, you notice it's a little bit more muted. Again, more muted. I like it on vivid. It gives it a nice look, but some renders could do with less saturation. And then changing this, you can change the saturation manually like this. I think that it could go a little bit higher, maybe from 1, so maybe 1.05, just like that, make it look a little bit better. The color correction is sort of like a color grading sort of thing. You're changing the white point. So if I bring it all the way down, it's going to be blue, and if I bring it all the way up, it's going to be like a more reddish. I think it's fine as is, so I'm going to turn that off. And then the bloom amount and bloom width, that is for emissive materials. So I'm just going to apply these settings by hitting apply. And what you'll notice is now we have another tab. Don't worry, this is not doing a full render. And now we have our changed image here. And you can see it's more like more vibrant than this one. We turned up the exposure a little bit, turned up the saturation. I think it looks better than our original. So now I want to, if we looked at the local render like this, I would not be able to do the post-processing. So that's why sometimes it can be better to do a cloud render, check to see if your settings are right, use the post-processing tab to get all the exposure and saturation just how you want it, and then use the local to do a finished one. But often the cloud render can give great results quickly. If your machine has a bad CPU, you don't have to worry about it taking too long to render or Fusion crashing. So the cloud render is great, especially since on the Education Edition you have unlimited cloud credits. So if I want to download this, I have some options here. PNG is probably the best. It's sort of like the lossless format. I would recommend PNG. if we turned on transparent background, it would sort of turn off this HDRI and we just see the object. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to do this. So I'm just going to put our cube demo just like this. We can save that, and then I'm going to do a transparent background, download PNG again, and it's preparing it, and then we can do cube demo 2, and we can take a look at what that looks like. So if I go over here in our renders and we find our cube demo, what you would notice is we have like this, and we have the background. It's all just how it looked like. And then if we go over to this one, you'll notice that it's transparent in the back. So this can be nice if you just want the robot and you want the benefits of the realistic lighting of the HDRI or anything. Usually I keep the background, as it gives it a little bit more realism. So that's that. And that's basically it for this video. In the next video, we'll be rendering our screw and nut. We'll be making a table for it to sit on. We'll be putting in this HDRI, making all our settings nice. So I hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next video.